Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I've replayed that evening in my mind more times than I can count, wondering if I should have arrived later like everyone else, wondering if ignorance would have been kinder. But I've always been the kind of mother who shows up early. I show up prepared. I show up with extra napkins in my purse and a backup plan in my heart. The restaurant was one of those upscale places downtown, with dim golden lights and white tablecloths that made you sit up straighter than usual. My daughter, Lila, had chosen it herself. She said it felt grown. I remember smiling at that word because in my mind, she was still the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest while I hummed off-key lullabies. I had spent the afternoon carefully curling my hair, choosing a navy dress that didn't make me look like I was trying too hard, and wrapping the engagement gift I had saved for months to buy. It was my mother's bracelet, reset and polished, something old made new again. That felt symbolic at the time. I arrived 40 minutes early because traffic was lighter than expected. I thought I'd sit at the bar and wait, maybe calm my nerves. Engagement dinners aren't just celebrations for mothers. They're quiet goodbyes. You tell yourself you're gaining a son, but you also know you're letting go of your first baby. As I walked toward the private dining room the hostess had mentioned, I heard voices. The door wasn't fully closed. I recognized Ethan's voice immediately, smooth, confident, always just slightly rehearsed. I had never fully warmed to him, though I tried. He had that polished charm that makes strangers adore you, but leaves mothers uneasy. "She doesn't need to know the details," he said, and I stopped mid-step. There was a short laugh, not cruel, not kind, just dismissive. "Once we're married, it's not like she can undo it." My heart thudded so loudly I thought they might hear it through the door. There was another voice, male, probably his friend Marcus. "You're sure her mom won't dig into it?" Ethan scoffed softly. "Her mom? She worships Lila. She won't want to ruin this. Besides, Lila understands why this makes sense. It's temporary." Temporary. That word hung in the air like smoke. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe properly. My palms turned cold. I edged closer to the door without meaning to, the way you inch toward the edge of a cliff even when you know you shouldn't look down. "The debt's bigger than I told her," Ethan continued, voice lower now. "But once the merger goes through and I use her credit, we'll be fine. It's just paperwork. Marriage makes it easier." My body reacted before my mind could process it. My knees weakened and I had to steady myself against the wall. Use her credit, merger, debt, paperwork, words that had nothing to do with love. "And she's okay with that?" Marcus asked. Ethan paused. "She doesn't love the idea, but she loves me, and she knows this is how couples build together." The way he said build sounded like borrow, like leverage, like transaction. I felt something inside me shift, not break exactly, but rearrange itself into a colder shape. I had raised Lila to be compassionate, to see the good in people, sometimes even when it wasn't there. Had I raised her to be naive? I stepped back as chairs scraped lightly inside the room. Panic flooded me. I couldn't let them see me standing there like some eavesdropping villain. I forced myself to walk down the hallway, my heels echoing too loudly against the polished floor. I ducked into the restroom and locked myself in a stall, gripping the engagement gift so tightly the wrapping paper crinkled. My reflection in the mirror looked pale, older than I felt that morning. I told myself there had to be context. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe he had phrased it poorly. People talk differently with friends, but the words, "once we're married, it's not like she can undo it," kept replaying. Marriage is not a trap. It's not a strategy. It's not leverage. It's supposed to be a promise. I thought about Lila at 16, crying on the kitchen floor after her first heartbreak, telling me she just wanted someone who chose her fully. I had held her and said, "One day a man will love you in a way that feels safe." Safe, that was the word. Did this sound safe? I heard laughter drifting faintly from the dining room, and it made my stomach twist. Part of me wanted to storm in, slam the gift down, and demand explanations. Another part of me was terrified of being wrong, of embarrassing Lila, of being the overprotective mother who sabotages her daughter's happiness because she can't let go. I have never wanted to control Lila's life. I just wanted her protected from the kind of consequences that linger for decades. I splashed cool water on my face and practiced a neutral expression. When I finally walked into the private dining room, Ethan was standing near the table adjusting his jacket. He smiled brightly when he saw me. "Mrs. Harper, you're early." His tone was light, effortless. If I hadn't heard him minutes before, I might have believed it completely. "Traffic was kind," I replied, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. Lila rushed over and hugged me tightly. She smelled of jasmine and nerves. "Mom, you look beautiful," she whispered. I held her longer than usual. I wondered if she could feel my heartbeat racing. I pulled back and searched her face for signs: hesitation, doubt, fear. Instead, I saw excitement layered over something else, something I couldn't quite name. Was it worry? Or was that just my projection? As we sat down, Ethan began talking about future plans, about expanding opportunities, about strategic timing. The language was businesslike, not romantic. I watched Lila carefully. Each time he mentioned finances, her smile tightened just slightly, just enough for a mother to notice. At one point, he squeezed her hand and said, "We're a team, right?" She nodded, but her eyes flickered toward me for a fraction of a second, and in that fleeting glance, I saw it: conflict. I realized then that Ethan hadn't been entirely honest in that hallway. Lila did know something, maybe not everything, but enough to make her uneasy. The dinner continued with polite laughter and clinking glasses, but beneath the table my mind was assembling questions like puzzle pieces. How much debt? What merger? Why the urgency to marry before resolving it? I felt as though I were watching a contract being signed rather than a love story unfolding. When the waiter poured champagne, Ethan stood to make a toast. "To new beginnings," he said confidently, "to building a future together." Everyone raised their glasses. I lifted mine too, but I didn't drink, because as I looked at my daughter's trembling fingers wrapped around the stem of her glass, I knew this wasn't just about young love and financial mistakes. It was about power, and whether my daughter understood the difference between partnership and sacrifice. That night, as applause filled the room, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not explode, I would not accuse, but I would not stay silent either. I had arrived early by accident. What I heard was not an accident, and before this wedding moved 1 inch closer to reality, I was going to find out exactly what my daughter had agreed to and whether she felt she had a choice. The rest of that dinner passed in a blur of polite smiles and carefully measured responses, but inside me something had awakened that would not settle back down. I have always trusted my instincts. They are not dramatic or loud. They are quiet, persistent, like a drip of water that eventually hollows stone. And all through Ethan's toast, through the dessert plates and photographs and clinking glasses, that quiet voice kept saying, "This isn't right." When we finally stepped outside the restaurant into the cool evening air, Leela looped her arm through mine. Ethan stayed behind a moment to settle the bill. The street lights cast a soft glow across her face, and I could see exhaustion beneath her makeup. "Are you happy?" I asked gently, keeping my tone light enough that it didn't feel like an interrogation. She hesitated, just for a breath. "Of course I am, Mom," she replied, but her voice didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's just a lot happening at once." "A lot happening at once," I nodded slowly. "Marriage is a big step. It should feel steady, not rushed." She swallowed and looked down at her engagement ring. "It's not rushed," she said quickly. Too quickly. That quiet voice in me grew louder. I didn't push further right there on the sidewalk. There are conversations that need privacy and courage. Instead, I squeezed her hand. "Come by tomorrow," I said softly. "Just you. We'll have coffee." She studied my face for a moment as if trying to read whether I knew something. "Okay," she agreed after a pause. "Tomorrow." That night, I barely slept. I lay awake replaying every word I had overheard, every flicker in Leela's expression. I kept thinking about the way Ethan had said, "Once we're married, it's not like she can undo it." Marriage is not a trapdoor that closes behind you. It should never feel like a deadline for financial maneuvering. By morning, I had decided on one thing. I would not attack Ethan in front of her. If I cornered her, she would defend him automatically. Love does that. Instead, I needed her to feel safe enough to tell the truth. When Leela arrived the next afternoon, she wasn't wearing her ring. That was the first thing I noticed. She stepped into the kitchen, hugging herself as if she were cold. I had brewed her favorite hazelnut coffee, but she didn't touch it. We sat at the small wooden table where she used to do homework. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I reached across and covered her hand with mine. "Leela," I began carefully, "is there anything about this engagement that's making you uncomfortable?" Her eyes flickered up to mine, and there it was again, that internal struggle. "Why would you ask that?" she whispered. I inhaled slowly. This was the moment. "Because I arrived early last night," I said softly, "and I heard part of a conversation." Her face drained of color. She didn't ask what I heard. That told me everything. "How much did you hear?" she asked quietly. "Enough," I replied. The silence that followed felt heavy but necessary. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they were glossy with tears. "He said it sounds worse than it is," he murmured. "He said you wouldn't understand." That hurt more than I expected, not because I need to be right, but because my daughter believed I might choose pride over her well-being. "Try me," I said gently. She took a shaky breath. "Ethan's company isn't doing as well as he made it seem. There's a merger opportunity, but his credit, it's complicated. He needs better financial standing to secure the deal. If we're married, our combined assets make it easier." Combined assets. Such clinical words for something that could shape her entire future. "How much debt?" I asked softly. She hesitated again. "More than he first told me." My stomach tightened. "How much, Leela?" "Almost $200,000, she whispered. The number landed between us like a stone. $200,000. My daughter had worked hard to build her savings, to establish her own credit, to protect her independence. "And he wants to marry before this merger?" I asked. She nodded. "He says it's the fastest way. He promises once the deal goes through, everything will stabilize." Promises built on risk and urgency. I leaned back slightly, steadying myself. "And if the merger fails?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer. Tears slid down her cheeks instead. "He says I'm not supporting him if I hesitate," she added, cracking. "He says couples take risks together." I felt anger rise in my chest, but I kept my tone calm. "Taking risks together is different from being used as collateral," I said gently. She flinched at that word, collateral. It sounded harsh, but it was honest. "He loves me. I know he does." I reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek. "Love does not pressure. Love does not corner you with deadlines. Love does not say, once we're married, you can't undo it." Her eyes widened. "He said that?" she whispered. I inhaled slowly. This was the moment. "Because I arrived early last night," I said softly, "and I heard part of a conversation." Her face drained of color. She didn't ask what I heard. That told me everything. "How much did you hear?" she asked quietly. "Enough," I replied. The silence that followed felt heavy but necessary. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they were glossy with tears. "He said it sounds worse than it is," he murmured. "He said you wouldn't understand." That hurt more than I expected, not because I need to be right, but because my daughter believed I might choose pride over her well-being. "Try me," I said gently. She took a shaky breath. "Ethan's company isn't doing as well as he made it seem. There's a merger opportunity, but his credit, it's complicated. He needs better financial standing to secure the deal. If we're married, our combined assets make it easier." Combined assets. Such clinical words for something that could shape her entire future. How much debt? I asked softly. She hesitated again. More than he first told me. My stomach tightened. How much, Leela? Almost $200,000, she whispered. The number landed between us like a stone. $200,000. My daughter had worked hard to build her savings, to establish her own credit, to protect her independence. And he wants to marry before this merger? I asked. She nodded. He says it's the fastest way. He promises once the deal goes through, everything will stabilize. Promises built on risk and urgency. I leaned back slightly, steadying myself. And if the merger fails? I asked quietly. She didn't answer. Tears slid down her cheeks instead. He says I'm not supporting him if I hesitate, she added, cracking. He says couples take risks together. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I kept my tone calm. Taking risks together is different from being used as collateral, I said gently. She flinched at that word, collateral. It sounded harsh, but it was honest. He loves me. I know he does. I reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek. Love does not pressure. Love does not corner you with deadlines. Love does not say, once we're married, you can't undo it. Her eyes widened. He said that? She whispered. I inhaled slowly. This was the moment. Because I arrived early last night, I said softly, and I heard part of a conversation. Her face drained of color. She didn't ask what I heard. That told me everything. How much did you hear? She asked quietly. Enough, I replied. The silence that followed felt heavy but necessary. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they were glossy with tears. He said it sounds worse than it is, he murmured. He said you wouldn't understand. That hurt more than I expected, not because I need to be right, but because my daughter believed I might choose pride over her well-being. Try me, I said gently. She took a shaky breath. Ethan's company isn't doing as well as he made it seem. There's a merger opportunity, but his credit, it's complicated. He needs better financial standing to secure the deal. If we're married, our combined assets make it easier. Combined assets. Such clinical words for something that could shape her entire future. How much debt? I asked softly. She hesitated again. More than he first told me. My stomach tightened. How much, Leela? Almost $200,000, she whispered. The number landed between us like a stone. $200,000. My daughter had worked hard to build her savings, to establish her own credit, to protect her independence. And he wants to marry before this merger? I asked. She nodded. He says it's the fastest way. He promises once the deal goes through, everything will stabilize. Promises built on risk and urgency. I leaned back slightly, steadying myself. And if the merger fails? I asked quietly. She didn't answer. Tears slid down her cheeks instead. He says I'm not supporting him if I hesitate, she added, cracking. He says couples take risks together. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I kept my tone calm. Taking risks together is different from being used as collateral, I said gently. She flinched at that word, collateral. It sounded harsh, but it was honest. He loves me. I know he does. I reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek. Love does not pressure. Love does not corner you with deadlines. Love does not say, once we're married, you can't undo it. Her eyes widened. He said that? That evening, after Leela left my house, I stood at the kitchen window longer than necessary, watching the sky shift from pale blue to a bruised shade of purple. I knew she was driving straight to Ethan's apartment. I knew a confrontation was coming, and I knew that whatever happened next would either strengthen her resolve or pull her deeper into something she might not be ready to see clearly. There is a particular kind of helplessness that comes with motherhood when your child is grown. When they were small, I could shield her from scraped knees and cruel classmates. But now the risks were contracts and signatures and legal bindings. The dangers didn't leave visible bruises. They left financial scars that could last decades. Around 8 that night, my phone rang. I had been sitting on the couch pretending to read, though I hadn't turned a page in an hour. When I saw Leela's name flash across the screen, my breath caught. I answered immediately. "Mom?" Her voice was tight, controlled. "I told him I want to postpone the wedding." I closed my eyes slowly. "And?" There was a pause long enough for me to hear her inhale shakily. "He didn't take it well." Of course he didn't. I had expected anger, but I hadn't expected what came next. "He said I was humiliating him," she continued. "He said I was letting you poison my mind. He said if I loved him, I'd trust him." There it was again, trust twisted into obedience. "Did you ask for the documents?" I asked gently. "Yes," she said. "He said it was insulting." I felt something cold settle into my chest. Transparency should never feel insulting. "Where are you right now?" I asked. "In my car," she whispered. "I left." Relief washed over me so intensely I had to sit down. "Come here," I said immediately. "Come home." She arrived 20 minutes later with red eyes and trembling hands. The moment she stepped inside, she broke, not in loud sobs, but in quiet, exhausted tears that seemed to carry weeks of tension. "He said if I delay this, he doesn't know if he can stay," she murmured against my shoulder. "He said this opportunity won't come again." I held her and let her cry. Sometimes clarity begins with grief. After a while, she pulled back and wiped her face. "I feel stupid," she whispered. "I should have seen it." I shook my head firmly. "You are not stupid for loving someone," I said softly, "but you are wise for questioning pressure." She sat at the kitchen table again, staring at her bare ring finger. "He made it sound like we were building something together," she said, "like I was being selfish for hesitating." I poured her a glass of water and sat across from her. "Building together requires equal footing," I said gently, "not one person carrying the weight while the other sets the timeline." She nodded slowly. "He also said," she hesitated, "he said if I walk away now, I'll regret it, that no one else will understand his ambition the way I do." I almost laughed at the manipulation of that statement, but I kept my tone steady. "Ambition that depends on urgency and secrecy is not partnership," I said quietly. "It's leverage." She leaned back in her chair, thinking. I could see her reassembling the past few months in her mind, every rushed conversation, every subtle push, every guilt-laced reassurance. "He always framed it as us against the world, but it started to feel like me against doubt." That sentence told me she was waking up. "What do you want?" I asked gently. Not what should you do, not what's safest. What do you want? She stared at the table for a long moment. "I want to feel safe," she said finally. "I want to marry someone because it feels steady, not because it's strategically convenient." Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them back. "Then hold on to that," I whispered. Her phone buzzed on the table. Ethan, the name, lit up the screen. She stared at it without touching it. It buzzed again and again. Finally, she silenced it and turned the phone face down. That small act felt monumental. "He's going to show up here," she said quietly. I knew she was probably right. Ethan was not the type to relinquish control without a final attempt to reclaim it. And sure enough, 45 minutes later, headlights swept across my living room walls. My stomach tightened. Leela froze. "You don't have to see him," I said gently. But she inhaled slowly and stood. "No," she said, voice steadier than before. "I do." I walked to the door with her. When I opened it, Ethan stood there with his jaw tight and his composure carefully assembled. "Mrs. Harper," he greeted, though there was no warmth in it. "Leela," he said immediately, stepping forward. "Can we talk?" She didn't move aside. "We are talking," she replied calmly. He glanced at me, irritation flickering in his eyes. "This is between us," he said pointedly. I met his gaze evenly. "Then speak respectfully," I answered. He exhaled sharply, then turned back to Leela. "You're making a mistake. You're letting fear control you." Leela's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I asked for transparency. You called it insulting." His jaw tightened. "Because it is. You either trust me or you don't." She took a slow breath. "Trust is earned with honesty, not deadlines." For a split second, I saw something shift in his expression. Not love, not hurt, calculation. "If you walk away now, don't expect me to wait around." The threat hung in the air. And in that moment, I saw my daughter truly see him. Not the charming partner, not the ambitious dreamer, but the man who measured love against leverage. "Then don't wait," she replied softly. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatic, it was calm, final. Ethan stared at her as if he hadn't expected resistance. Then his expression hardened. "You'll regret this," he muttered, and just like that, he turned and walked back to his car. We stood in the doorway watching his taillights disappear into the dark. Leela exhaled slowly as if she had been holding her breath for months. Then she leaned into me. "It hurts," she whispered. I wrapped my arms around her. "Of course it does," I said gently, "but hurt is temporary. Regret can last a lifetime." That night, she slept in her old bedroom. I lay awake again, but this time my thoughts were steadier. The storm had passed, though the aftermath remained. In the quiet of the house, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was proud. Proud that she chose clarity over comfort. Proud that she'd faced pressure and stepped back instead of surrendering. I had arrived at that dinner early by accident, but perhaps some moments in life are timed by something deeper than coincidence. If I hadn't heard that conversation, she might have silenced her doubts. She might have mistaken urgency for devotion. Instead, she listened to the quiet voice inside her, and that voice saved her. The morning after Ethan drove away felt strangely still, as if the world had paused to let us catch our breath. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains in Lila's old bedroom, landing on the shelves where her childhood trophies still stood. I stood in the hallway for a long moment before knocking gently on her door. "Come in," she called, her voice tired but steady. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, wearing one of her old college sweatshirts, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. Without the engagement ring, without the carefully applied makeup from the dinner, she looked younger, vulnerable, but also lighter somehow. "How did you sleep?" I asked quietly. She gave a small, honest smile. "I actually slept," she said, "for the first time in weeks." That told me more than anything else could have. When anxiety leaves, the body knows. We moved to the kitchen and sat with our coffee, not rushing to fill the silence. Sometimes healing begins in quiet spaces. After a while, she spoke. "I didn't realize how much pressure I was under," she admitted. "Every conversation with him felt like a countdown, like we had to hurry before something disappeared." I stirred my coffee slowly. "Real love doesn't operate on expiration dates," I said gently. She nodded, absorbing that. Her phone buzzed again on the table. Ethan. She didn't reach for it. A few minutes later, another message, then another. I watched her carefully. "You don't have to respond," I reminded her softly. She exhaled. "I know. Part of me feels guilty." There it was again, guilt, the most effective tool in emotional manipulation. "Guilt for protecting yourself?" I asked gently. She looked at me and shook her head slightly, as if the logic was beginning to click into place. By midday, the messages had shifted in tone. She finally opened one, her expression tightening as she read. "He says I embarrassed him in front of his friends," she murmured. "He says I'm overreacting and that my fear cost him a major opportunity." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice calm. "If an opportunity depends on your silence and your signature without clarity, it was never a shared opportunity," I said. She swallowed slowly. "He also says his parents are disappointed in me." I almost smiled sadly at that. The expansion of pressure, bring in outside judgment, increase the emotional weight. "Lila," I said softly, leaning forward, "notice how none of those messages ask how you're feeling." She looked down at the phone again. Her eyes softened and I saw recognition. "You're right," she whispered. "It's all about what he lost." Exactly. The day passed in a strange in-between space, not quite grief, not quite relief. Around late afternoon, Lila received a call from an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" she said cautiously. I watched her face shift from confusion to surprise. "Mrs. Bennett?" she repeated. That was Ethan's mother. I felt a ripple of tension in my chest. Lila put the phone on speaker without saying anything. "Lila, sweetheart," Mrs. Bennett's voice chimed, overly sweet and composed. "Ethan told us there was a misunderstanding." Misunderstanding, such a gentle word for something so heavy. "I don't think it was a misunderstanding," Lila replied calmly. "I asked for transparency." There was a brief pause. "Marriage requires trust," Mrs. Bennett said smoothly. "You can't build a family if you question everything." I felt heat rise in my chest, but I stayed silent. This had to be Lila's moment. "Trust also requires honesty," Lila responded, her voice steadier now. "I wasn't given full information." Mrs. Bennett's tone shifted ever so slightly, the sweetness thinning. "Young people today are so cautious," she said lightly. "In our day, we supported our husbands." There it was, generational guilt layered onto personal pressure. Lila inhaled slowly. "I want a partnership," she said firmly, "not a rescue mission." Silence stretched across the line. Then Mrs. Bennett sighed. "Well," she said coolly, "if you can't stand beside him during hardship, perhaps you aren't ready for marriage." The statement was meant to wound, but instead of shrinking, I watched my daughter straighten up. "Hardship is different from secrecy," she replied. "I wish you well." And with that, she ended the call. The kitchen fell silent. I realized my hands were clenched and forced them to relax. Lila looked at me, her expression a mixture of sadness and clarity. "They all talk like I failed some test," she murmured. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You passed the only test that matters," I said softly. "You listened to your instincts." That evening, she finally removed the engagement photos from her social media. It was a quiet but symbolic act. As each image disappeared, I saw her reclaiming something invisible but essential, her autonomy. Of course, the world noticed. Friends texted, questions poured in. Some offered support, others asked carefully worded inquiries. She answered simply, "We realized we wanted different things. No drama, no details, just truth." Later that night, as we sat on the couch, she leaned her head against my shoulder like she used to when she was a child. She said, "I keep thinking about what you overheard. If you hadn't arrived early—" Her voice trailed off. I let the silence linger before responding. "Then something else would have shown you," I said gently. "Truth has a way of surfacing." She was quiet for a long moment. "I think I was trying to prove I could handle it," she admitted, "like supporting him made me strong." I brushed her hair back from her face. "Strength isn't measured by how much you carry for someone else. It's measured by what you refuse to carry when it isn't yours." She closed her eyes, breathing deeply. For the first time since the engagement dinner, the air in the house felt light. Not because there was no pain. There was. Breakups, even necessary ones, leave bruises on the heart. But beneath the sadness was something steadier, self-respect. As I went to bed that night, I thought about the bracelet I had wrapped for her engagement gift. It still sat in my closet, untouched. Something old made new again. I realized then that perhaps the symbolism had been misplaced. It wasn't about her relationship. It was about her, about rebuilding herself without compromise. I drifted to sleep knowing the hardest part had passed. But I also knew healing is not a single decision. It's a series of small, brave ones. And my daughter had just taken her first. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful exactly, but reflective. There's a difference. Peace feels light. Reflection feels heavy but purposeful, like sorting through boxes in an attic you've avoided for years. Leela stayed with me that entire week. She said she needed space, but I could tell she also needed grounding. Every morning we walked around the neighborhood together, the early air cool against our faces. She didn't talk much at first. Grief has its own rhythm. It doesn't rush just because the decision was right. On the third morning, as we passed the park where I used to push her on the swings, she finally spoke. "I keep replaying everything," she said softly. "All the little comments I brushed aside." I nodded. "Like what?" She exhaled slowly. "He used to joke about how responsible I am with money. He'd say, 'That's why we'll be unstoppable together.' At the time, it felt like a compliment." I felt a quiet ache in my chest. "Compliments can hide expectations," I said gently. She kicked at a small pebble on the sidewalk. "He also started pushing for joint accounts before we were even married, said it would show commitment." I stopped walking for a moment and looked at her. "Did that feel right to you?" She shook her head. "Not really, but every time I hesitated, he'd ask if I was planning for an exit." There it was again, doubt reframed as betrayal. We resumed walking. The trees above us rustled softly, and I thought about how subtle control can be. It rarely arrives as a shout. It arrives as suggestion, as urgency, as guilt dressed up as devotion. Later that afternoon, Leela received an email from Ethan. Not a text, not a call, an email. Formal, structured, almost like a business memo. She read it silently at first, then handed the phone to me without a word. I scanned it carefully. He detailed the financial opportunity again, outlining projected gains from the merger, framing the entire situation as a strategic setback caused by emotional interference. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge her feelings. Instead, he wrote that he hoped she would reconsider her position with maturity. I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my voice even. "What do you notice?" I asked her. She stared at the screen again. "It sounds like a contract negotiation," she whispered. "Not a love letter." "Exactly." She sat back slowly. "There's not one sentence asking if I'm okay." I reached over and closed the email. "Because the relationship was never about mutual safety," I said gently. "It was about forward momentum." That evening, something shifted again. Instead of sadness, I saw anger flicker in her eyes. Not explosive anger, but clarity-driven anger. "I feel manipulated," she admitted, "like my love was used as leverage." I nodded slowly. "That's a painful realization," I said, "but it's also powerful." She looked at me curiously. "Powerful?" "Because once you recognize manipulation," I replied softly, "it loses its grip." The next day, she asked if we could visit the bank together. I didn't ask questions. I simply grabbed my purse. She sat with a financial advisor and reviewed every account connected to Ethan. There weren't many, thankfully. She had been cautious enough not to fully merge anything yet. But there were shared planning documents, preliminary forms, drafts of joint agreements. She requested that her name be removed from anything that wasn't finalized. As she signed the cancellation paperwork, I watched her shoulders straighten. That was the moment I truly saw her step back into herself. On the drive home, she stared out the window thoughtfully. "I think I was afraid of starting over," she admitted. "At 32, it felt like everyone else was settling down." I smiled gently. "Settling down is not the same as settling," I said. She laughed softly at that, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in days. That sound alone made every uncomfortable conversation worth it. A few days later, Ethan showed up at her apartment building. She had returned there briefly to gather some belongings. He didn't know she wasn't staying. He approached her in the parking lot, voice calm but urgent. "We can fix this," he told her. "You're overthinking it." She recounted the conversation to me later that night, her voice steady. "I asked him one question," she said. "I asked if he would delay the merger until we were financially transparent and stable." I leaned forward slightly. "And?" She gave a sad smile. "He said that wasn't practical." That was all she needed to hear. Love can bend, ego cannot. She walked away without raising her voice, without arguing, without defending herself, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. The messages stopped after that. Silence can be the final answer. A week after the engagement dinner, I finally took the bracelet out of my closet. I handed it to her one evening as we sat at the kitchen table. She looked at it with confusion. "Mom," she began. I shook my head gently. "This was meant for your engagement," I said softly, "but it's still yours." She traced her fingers over the polished metal. "Why now?" she asked quietly. I smiled at her. "Because it symbolizes something stronger than marriage. It symbolizes legacy, and you choosing yourself is part of that legacy." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they weren't heavy, they were cleansing. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist and held it there for a moment. "I thought losing him meant losing the future I imagined." I squeezed her hand. "Sometimes losing the wrong future makes space for the right one." That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone in the living room reflecting on everything that had unfolded. I realized something profound. I hadn't saved my daughter. She had saved herself. I had only held up a mirror and asked questions. The rest was her courage. I arrived early to that dinner thinking I was there to celebrate love. Instead, I became a witness to truth. And truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is always a gift. 2 weeks after the engagement fell apart, the house felt different again. Not heavy, not tense, just quieter in a way that felt transitional, like the pause between chapters. Leela had returned to her apartment, slowly reclaiming her space. She repainted one wall in her bedroom a soft sage green and donated the decorative pieces Ethan had insisted were more mature. She told me that every object she removed felt like peeling off a layer of someone else's expectations. Healing, I've learned, isn't loud. It's made of small decisions repeated consistently. One evening, she invited me over for dinner. She cooked pasta from scratch, something she hadn't done in months because, as she admitted, Ethan preferred takeout and said cooking was inefficient. As we sat at her tiny dining table, she looked around her apartment with a softness I hadn't seen before. "It feels like mine again," she said quietly. I smiled, noticing the absence of tension in her shoulders. "That's because it is," I replied. She twirled her fork thoughtfully. "I keep thinking about that word, inefficient," she added. "He used it for everything. My caution, my questions, even my emotions." I nodded slowly. "Efficiency is useful in business," I said, "not in love." She let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. "I was adjusting myself to fit his timeline," she admitted. I stopped asking follow-up questions because it made him frustrated. I looked at her gently. "You were trying to preserve harmony." She shook her head slightly. "No, I was trying to avoid conflict. There's a difference. Preserving harmony is mutual. Avoiding conflict at your own expense is erosion." A few days later, something unexpected happened. Leela received a call from Marcus, the friend who had been in that restaurant room the night I overheard everything. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. I was at her apartment when it happened. She put the call on speaker. Marcus sounded hesitant. I wanted to say I'm sorry," he began awkwardly. Leela stiffened. "For what?" she asked carefully. He exhaled heavily. "For not speaking up that night. Ethan's been in trouble financially longer than you know. This merger was more desperate than strategic." I felt my stomach tighten. Confirmation carries its own weight. "How long?" Leela asked quietly. "Almost a year," Marcus admitted. He's been juggling loans. When he said marriage would stabilize things, I should have realized that wasn't fair to you." Leela closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you for telling me," she said calmly. After the call ended, she sat very still, not shocked, not devastated, just affirmed. "I wasn't crazy," she whispered. I reached across and squeezed her hand. "No," I said softly, "you weren't." That evening, she did something that surprised me. She wrote Ethan a final message, not to argue, not to reopen wounds, but to close the door with clarity. She read it aloud before sending it. "I cared about you deeply, but I need a relationship built on transparency, not urgency. I hope you find stability, but I won't be the solution to financial instability disguised as partnership." She hit send without trembling. There was no dramatic response, no apology, no fight, just silence. And sometimes silence is the clearest answer. Weeks passed. Slowly, life began to feel expansive again. Leela reconnected with friends she had drifted from during the whirlwind of wedding planning. She took a short weekend trip alone, something Ethan had once called unnecessary spending. When she returned, her eyes were brighter. "I forgot what it feels like to make decisions without negotiating them," she admitted. One afternoon, as we sat on my porch watching the sunset, she said something that stayed with me. "I think I confused being needed with being loved." I turned to look at her carefully. "Explain that," I said gently. She tucked her legs beneath her on the chair. "He made me feel essential, like I was the key to his future. It felt powerful, but it wasn't mutual." I nodded slowly. "Being needed can feel intoxicating, but being valued feels steady." She smiled faintly. "Steady sounds better." There was a softness in her now that hadn't been there before, not fragility, but awareness. She was no longer measuring herself by someone else's urgency. She had reclaimed her pace, and that pace felt calm. One evening, as she was leaving my house, she paused at the door. "Mom," she said quietly, "when you heard that conversation, were you scared?" I considered the question carefully. "Yes," I answered honestly, "but not because I doubted you. I was scared you might silence your instincts to protect someone else's pride." She nodded slowly. "No, I almost did." I reached up and brushed her hair back from her face, something I've done since she was little. "That's why we talk," I said gently, "so we remember who we are." After she left, I sat alone in my living room, reflecting on how close she had come to tying her future to someone who saw her as an asset rather than a partner. I thought about the power of arriving early, about timing, about listening. I realized something profound. Protection doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like a quiet question asked at the right moment. If I had stormed into that restaurant that night, accusing and dramatic, she might have defended him harder. Instead, I chose calm. I chose patience, and that gave her space to see clearly. A month after the engagement ended, Leela hosted a small dinner at her apartment. Not an engagement celebration, not a rebound gathering, just friends, laughter, and homemade food. I watched her from across the room as she moved easily between conversations, her energy unburdened. She wasn't searching for validation, she wasn't performing stability, she simply was. As I drove home that night, I felt something settle inside me. I hadn't lost a son-in-law, I had gained a deeper understanding of my daughter's strength, and perhaps she had gained something too, not cynicism, but discernment, the kind that doesn't make you bitter, the kind that makes you careful in the best way. I arrived early to my daughter's engagement dinner thinking I was there to witness a beginning. Instead, I witnessed an ending that protected her future. And sometimes the endings we fear most are the ones that save us. It's strange how quickly life can return to something that resembles normal, even after a storm that once felt overwhelming. About 6 weeks after the engagement ended, the rhythm of our days had steadied. Leela was back at work full-time, her voice on the phone lighter, her laughter less forced. But healing doesn't move in straight lines. Some mornings she woke up energized and certain. Other mornings she texted me simple messages like, "Why does it still hurt?" And I would reply the same way each time, because you cared, and that's not weakness. One Sunday afternoon, she came over unexpectedly, carrying a box. She set it on the kitchen table without speaking. Inside were the last remnants of her engagement, cards from friends, a half-completed wedding planner, fabric samples for bridesmaid dresses, and the shoes she had bought for the ceremony. She ran her fingers over the ivory heels thoughtfully. "I don't want to throw them away," she said quietly, "but I don't want them sitting in my closet either." I nodded slowly. "Then don't assign them to that memory," I said gently. "They're just shoes." She looked at me, considering that. After a moment, she smiled faintly. "You're right." She placed them back in the box. "I think I'll wear them somewhere beautiful, just not down that aisle." That evening, we sat on the back porch, the air warm and calm. She seemed reflective, but not fragile. "I keep thinking about how confident he sounded," she admitted, "like he truly believed what he was saying." I folded my hands in my lap. "Confidence doesn't equal truth," I said softly. "Sometimes it just means someone has convinced themselves." She leaned her head back against the chair. "Do you think he loved me?" The question hung between us. I didn't answer immediately. Honesty requires care. "I think he loved what you provided," I said gently. "Stability, loyalty, credibility. But love that depends on what you provide isn't the same as love that protects who you are." She absorbed that quietly. "I don't want to become cynical," she said after a while. "I don't want to assume every man has an agenda." I smiled softly. "Discernment is not cynicism," I said. "Cynicism assumes the worst. Discernment asks questions." She nodded slowly, as if storing that away. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Ethan posted online about a difficult breakup caused by incompatible visions. He didn't mention her name, but anyone who knew them could connect the dots. The comments poured in: sympathy, support, admiration for his ambition. Leela saw it. She didn't cry, she didn't rage. She simply handed me her phone and said, "He's rewriting the story." I scanned the post. It was polished, strategic, victim-adjacent without direct accusation. "Do you want to respond?" I asked gently. She shook her head. "No, the people who know me don't need clarification." That was growth, not the need to control perception, just the confidence to let truth exist without defense. That night, though, I noticed her scrolling through old photos. I sat beside her quietly. "It's okay to miss the good parts," I said softly. She nodded. "There were good parts," she admitted. "He could be thoughtful. He remembered small details." I squeezed her hand. "People are rarely entirely one thing," I said, "but patterns matter more than moments." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "I'm glad you heard what you heard, even if it hurt." I closed my eyes briefly. "Me too." As weeks turned into 2 months, I watched her step into something stronger than recovery. She enrolled in a financial planning course, not because she needed it, but because she wanted deeper independence. "I never want to feel uncertain about numbers again," she told me. I admired that. Instead of letting the experience make her fearful, she was letting it make her informed. One afternoon, she invited me to lunch near her office. As we sat across from each other, sunlight spilling through the window, she looked different, not dramatically, but settled. "I went on a date," she said casually. I raised my eyebrows slightly, but kept my expression neutral. "And?" She laughed softly. "It was fine, normal, no grand speeches about the future, no urgency, just coffee." I smiled. "How did it feel?" She considered that carefully. "Steady," she said. That word again, steady. It warmed me more than excitement ever could. "I'm not rushing anything," she added. "I just wanted to prove to myself that I'm not broken." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You were never broken," I said gently. "You were almost misled." Later that evening, as I drove home alone, I reflected on everything that had unfolded. I realized something profound about motherhood. We can't choose our children's partners. We can't prevent every mistake, but we can model calm, ask the right questions, and trust that what we've taught them will surface when it matters most. I had worried after that dinner that confronting the truth might push her away. Instead, it brought us closer. The bracelet she wore now glinted softly on her wrist, a reminder not of an engagement lost, but of a lesson learned. Love should never feel like a contract under pressure. It should feel like standing on solid ground. And as I watched my daughter rebuild her confidence piece by piece, I knew this story was no longer about betrayal. It was about awakening. Sometimes the most painful moments arrive disguised as celebration. And sometimes arriving early is the very thing that saves you from walking blindly into a promise that was never safe to begin with. By the third month, the sharpness of everything had softened into something almost instructive. The ache wasn't gone, but it no longer controlled the room. Leela had stopped checking Ethan's social media. She had stopped rereading old messages. The emotional fog that once clouded her judgment had lifted, replaced by a clearer, steadier air. But healing has layers, and sometimes the deeper ones surface when you least expect it. One evening she came over unexpectedly, her expression thoughtful rather than distressed. We sat at the kitchen table again, our place of reckoning, and she folded her hands in front of her. "I realized something today," she began quietly. "I wasn't just afraid of losing him. I was afraid of disappointing everyone." I tilted my head slightly. "Everyone?" She nodded. "Friends, extended family, coworkers. Everyone had already adjusted their image of me. I was engaged. I was moving forward. Calling it off felt like stepping backward." I let that sit for a moment. "Forward and backward are illusions sometimes," I said gently. "The only real direction is honest." She exhaled slowly, absorbing that. "I didn't want to be the woman whose engagement failed," she admitted. "There's this quiet shame around it." I reached across the table and took her hand. "There is no shame in refusing to marry under pressure," I said firmly but softly. "There is strength in it." She smiled faintly. "I know that now, but at first I kept imagining people whispering." I nodded knowingly. "People whisper about everything," I said, "but they don't live your life." That night we talked longer than usual, not about Ethan specifically, but about patterns, about how easily ambition can masquerade as confidence, about how subtle emotional pressure can feel like passion. "He used words like vision and future so often," she said. "It made questioning him feel small." I leaned back in my chair. "Big words can hide fragile foundations," I replied. "When someone rushes you toward a shared future without building present stability, that's not vision, that's projection." She stared at the ceiling thoughtfully. "I kept telling myself I needed to be more supportive, that doubt meant I wasn't loyal enough." I shook my head gently. "Doubt is a signal," I said. "It's not disloyalty, it's discernment asking for clarity." Over the next few weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Leela started volunteering at a financial literacy program for young women in her city. The idea had been planted after her own visit to the bank, when she realized how many people sign documents without fully understanding them. "If I can help even one woman pause and ask questions," she told me, "then this wasn't just a mistake, it was a lesson." I watched her stand in front of that small group one Saturday afternoon, speaking calmly about transparency, credit scores, and shared accounts. But beneath the practical advice was something deeper: self-worth. If anyone pressures you to combine finances before you feel ready, pause. Love should never depend on urgency. I felt tears gather in my eyes, but I blinked them away. She wasn't broken, she was transformed. A few days later, we revisited the restaurant where the engagement dinner had taken place. It was her idea. "I don't want that place to hold power over me," she said. We didn't book a private room. We simply sat at a small table near the window and ordered dessert. The lighting was the same, soft, golden, the hum of conversation familiar. She looked around slowly, then met my eyes. "This is where everything shifted," she said quietly. I nodded. "It is." She smiled faintly. "I'm grateful you were early." I laughed softly. "I've always been early." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You listened instead of reacting," she added. "That mattered." I thought back to that hallway, to the way my heart had pounded, to the urge to burst through the door and confront him immediately. Patience had felt unbearable in that moment, but restraint gave her space to see clearly. "Sometimes protection is quiet," I said softly. As we left the restaurant, she paused at the entrance and took a deep breath. "I thought my life was falling apart here," she admitted, "but it was actually rerouting." Rerouting. I liked that word. It didn't imply failure. It implied correction. Months earlier, I had feared she might mistake urgency for devotion. Now I watched her walk confidently down the sidewalk, her bracelet catching the streetlight, her steps unhurried. The pressure that once clouded her had dissolved. She wasn't rushing toward the next relationship. She wasn't proving anything to anyone. She was simply rebuilding at her own pace. Later that night, as I sat alone reflecting, I realized the story had shaped shape. It wasn't about Ethan anymore. It wasn't even about the engagement. It was about listening, to instinct, to discomfort, to the quiet voice that says, "Wait." So many people override that voice because they fear embarrassment or delay, but delay can be protection. A week later, Leela came over with news. "I got a promotion," she said, her eyes shining. "The leadership team noticed my initiative with the financial program." I hugged her tightly. "See," I whispered, "when you stop carrying someone else's urgency, you make space for your own growth." She laughed. "I think that's my new rule," she said. "No more urgency that isn't my own." And as I watched her drive away that evening, I understood something with absolute clarity. Arriving early that night had not just exposed a conversation, it had exposed a truth that could have been buried under wedding invitations and romantic speeches. Instead, it surfaced before the vows were spoken, and that made all the difference. By the time autumn arrived, nearly 5 months had passed since the engagement dinner. The leaves outside my home had begun to turn soft shades of amber and gold, and there was something poetic about that shift. Change doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it settles in quietly, like a season you suddenly realize has arrived. Leela had stepped fully back into her own rhythm. She wasn't just functioning anymore, she was thriving. But every transformation carries one final layer, the moment when you look back without flinching. One Saturday afternoon, she came over with an old photo album, not digital pictures on a screen, but the kind you hold in your hands. She set it on the coffee table between us. "I think I'm ready to look at this without feeling sick," she said gently. We opened it together. There were pictures of her and Ethan smiling at family gatherings, posing at holiday dinners, standing on a beach during a vacation that now felt like another lifetime. She traced her finger lightly over one photograph. "I was happy here," she said quietly. I nodded. "You were." She looked at me thoughtfully. "I don't want to rewrite history," she continued. "There were real feelings, real laughter." "Of course there were," I replied softly. "Love isn't fake just because it ends." She leaned back into the couch, thoughtful. "But I also see something now," she added. "In almost every photo, he's slightly ahead of me, leaning forward, talking. I'm listening." I studied the pictures more closely. She was right. It was subtle but visible. His body language led, hers followed. "You were attentive," I said gently, "but maybe too accommodating." She smiled faintly. "I was adjusting to his momentum." We closed the album slowly. There was no bitterness in her expression, just understanding. Later that week, she received a letter in the mail, an actual handwritten letter. It was from Ethan. Not apologetic exactly, but reflective in tone. He admitted the merger had fallen through. He acknowledged that he had underestimated the financial strain. He wrote that perhaps he had rushed things. Perhaps. That word lingered in my mind when she read it aloud. "How does it make you feel?" I asked gently. She thought for a moment. "Sad," she admitted. "Not because I want him back, but because I see how deeply he tied his identity to success." I nodded slowly. "And he tied your relationship to it, too." She exhaled. "Yes." She folded the letter neatly and set it aside. "I hope he finds stability," she added, "but it's not my job to be that stability." There was no anger in her voice, just clarity, and clarity is quieter than people expect. A few weeks later, she invited me to a small gathering at her apartment, friends, co-workers, neighbors. It wasn't a party with a theme or a milestone attached. It was simply a celebration of being present. As I watched her move around the room, introducing people, laughing easily, I noticed something profound. She wasn't seeking reassurance. She wasn't scanning faces for approval. She was comfortable, fully herself. At one point, I stepped onto the balcony for some air. She followed me a moment later. The city lights stretched out below us. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't heard that conversation?" she asked quietly. I considered that carefully. "Yes," I admitted, "but not with regret, with gratitude." She nodded. "I think I would have married him," she said honestly. "I would have told myself that doubt was just fear." I felt a chill run through me at the thought. "But you didn't," I said gently. She smiled softly. "Because you asked questions instead of accusing. You let me see it." I reached for her hand. "You saw it yourself," I corrected her. "I only held the light." She squeezed my fingers, her eyes shining, not with tears this time, but with something steadier, self-trust. In the months that followed, she continued dating casually but cautiously. She asked direct questions early. She didn't apologize for wanting clarity. If someone flinched at transparency, she stepped back without drama. And that, more than anything, told me she had changed. One evening, as we were folding laundry together, an ordinary, almost mundane moment, she said something that stopped me. "I used to think love meant proving I was ride or die," she said thoughtfully. "Now I think love means both people can walk away if respect disappears." I looked at her carefully. "That's maturity," I said softly. She smiled. "It's peace." And I realized she was right. Peace isn't dramatic. It doesn't sparkle like engagement rings or wedding toasts. It feels steady, grounded, quiet. The kind of feeling you wake up with instead of chase. As winter approached, she made one final decision that surprised even me. She sold the wedding dress she had purchased quietly months before. She donated the money to the financial literacy program she'd been volunteering with. "I want this story to do something good," she said simply. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not because she avoided a mistake, but because she transformed it into purpose. Sometimes life changes because of one overheard sentence, one moment when timing aligns with truth. I had arrived early that night thinking I was being helpful. I didn't know I was stepping into a turning point. But that's how change often works. It doesn't announce itself. It waits behind a half-closed door, asking if you're willing to listen. And because I listened, my daughter wanted to listen too.